Hello people, it is Monday the 13th of November and we are up to page 95 and we will be doing pages 95 to 113 today. Video 4. Oh god, my hair's a bit wild. Okay, Harry climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door. He liked going to the tip. Lots of devils had dens up there and they were slow and fat and almost tame from eating scraps and rotten food. Sometimes you could see them hanging around in the day, not like the ones near home that you could only hear late at night, growling and screaming and fighting when everything was dark. Sometimes Harry looked out the window and tried to see them, and sometimes he thought he saw eyes, little red eyes staring out through the scrub, but he was never sure. He knew Dad hated them, the sound they made. He knew if any devils ever made a den under the house, then Dad would shoot 'em. Harry hoped he would see some today. They had found even more of the car as they emptied the shed, mostly dented panels, bits and pieces of engine, and it was all loaded up in the trailer. The back of the van was full too. There was so much junk at Granddad's that they would probably have to make 4 trips or more to the tip. Joe backed out the drive and Harry waved to Miles. He was sitting on the veranda and he didn't wave back. He was meant to be going through the stuff in the house now, but Harry knew he would just sit there until they got back. He wanted to keep the house more than any of them. Joe didn't seem to mind much, and Auntie Jean said it had to happen. We could all do with the money, she said. Harry just thought Grandad would be sad about all his stuff going to the tip. Joe asked him if he was all right. Is it because I'm leaving, he asked. Harry shrugged. He wanted to wind down the window so he could breathe some cool air, but the car was kicking up so much dust off the road he'd better not. I'm coming back anyway after I've seen a few places. What places? Harry asked. First stop, Samoa. From there, who knows where? Who knows? Where's Samoa? South Pacific, you know, warm water, palm trees, white sand. Harry could picture places like that. He'd seen that stuff on TV and suddenly he wanted to tell Joe about George Fuller. He wanted to tell Joe how he'd gone to George's place and had tea and played with his dog Jake. He wanted to ask Joe if he knew George knew Grandad. Maybe Grandad kept the car because he thought he might find something, he said, and he felt the van slow down and pull over. Joe looked at him. What do you mean, Harry? Harry looked down at his legs. He wasn't sure. Maybe there was a man there in the car, he said. He wanted to say more about the man, but he couldn't really remember. Do you mean the man from the ambulance? Harry shrugged. He didn't want to talk about it anymore. He couldn't remember why he'd said that now. You hit your head really hard, remember? You had to go to hospital. Harry nodded. He remembered. Miles was in the ambulance too, and his head was all cut up and bleeding. And Harry had a grey blanket wrapped around him, and someone kept saying, you have to try and stay awake, over and over, and they kept shaking him, and he just wanted them to stop. He just wanted to go to sleep. When are you leaving? Harry asked. Soon, mate, soon. Miles walked down the path to the beach and sat down on the grey sand of Lady Bay. It was cloudy and overcast, but light was still reflecting off the water and it hurt his eyes. He squinted and let his eyes get used to the whiteness, and he looked over all the familiar rocks and sand and water. He was meant to be going through the house, but the house was full and stuffy and he didn't want to be in there. He put his hand in his pocket, pulled out the string, he held it up to the light. A shark's tooth, cold and sharp, a perfect blade. Everything that a shark was rotted and disappeared. Everything but its jaws and its teeth. That was all a shark could ever leave behind. And it was old, the tooth. It was yellow and old, and he tried to picture it. A mum's car, maybe swaying from the rear view, somewhere in the shed or in the workshop, and he tried to picture it in Mum's car, maybe swaying from the rear view mirror or sitting loose on the dash. He couldn't place it. He didn't know it. What's that? Miles looked up and it was Gary Bones standing there. Gary Bones, the big fool Ford who took hard marks and broke grown men. He grabbed the string out of Miles' hand and tucked the tooth up into his fist. Thanks, he said. Miles sat silent and he watched Gary Bones carry his rod and fish bucket and the shark tooth away. He watched him walk down the beach towards the bluff. He imagined him disappearing over the hill and imagined the tooth gone forever. Suddenly Miles was running. He was up and sprinted, picked up speed as he hit wet sand. Then he launched himself into the thick back of Gary Bones. Time went strange then. He was on the sand and he felt the cold water run up his trousers. He felt it soak right through and up onto his back. And there were hands on his shoulders, strong and gripping Gary Bones' hands. Miles turned his face away and looked out at the water, and he seemed to glow purple and metallic in the sunlight as Gary Bones' huge forehead came crashing down. The light was bright and blurred, and Miles leant up on his elbows slowly, trying to focus, and found Gary Bones standing there on the sand. He had something in his hands, a fishing rod. "It's broken," he said. "My dad's rod. It's broken." And he looked all weird and small like a kid. They must have landed on it when they fell. They must have busted it. Miles got to his feet and his face pulsed and throbbed and felt swollen. When he wiped his nose with the back of his hand, it stung like hell. Blood came away. It was there on the back of his hand. He started walking backwards, small steps, but Gary Bones noticed. Gary Bones was coming, and Miles didn't know what to do, so he just started talking out loud about the tooth and how he'd found it in the seat, and he didn't know whose it was, but he thought that maybe it had something to do with Mum, that maybe it was hers, and he thought that he should keep it because she was dead, because she died, and he tried not to look at Gary Bones while he talked. He tried to look at the ground, but Gary was standing so close Miles could even hear him breathe, and the fat knuckled fist dug into Miles' ribs and stayed there. "Who says I'm going to keep it? Who says?" And Gary Bones stared hard into Miles, smiled a tight, mean smile, but his fist moved away. He dropped the tooth on the sand. "If you weren't such a little freak, I'd beat the crap out of you, Miles." He was still in the bathroom inspecting his face when he heard the van get back. His nose looked okay now, not bleeding so much, but it was his teeth he was worried about. His tongue had been playing with one, pushing it this way and that, and it felt loose. It was definitely moved when he touched it. He parted his lips again to have another look. It was the little tooth just next to his big teeth, the front ones. "What the fuck happened to your face?" Joe was standing behind him, looking at him in the mirror. Miles turned around and pulled his top lip back even further. "Do you think my tooth's gonna fall out?" Joe put one hand under Miles's chin and lifted his head to the light. "This one." Miles marked the tooth out with his tongue. Joe touched it gently with his finger. "I think it's okay, but stop touching it. Stop moving it with your tongue. I'll get some ice." He let go of Miles's face and walked away to the kitchen, and now Harry was at the door looking in. "I fell," Miles said. Harry didn't say anything. He just stood there in the doorway, looking dumb with his mouth wide open. Miles pushed past him and followed Joe to the kitchen. Joe gave him a handful of ice wrapped in an old tea towel and pushed him out onto the veranda. Miles held the cloth lightly against the side of his nose, and it smelled thick with grease and oil and old cooked meat. Water dripped slowly from his hands, and Miles watched the drops land on the old wide floorboards below. He watched the wood suck the water in, and he could feel Joe standing near, just behind his back, almost touching. He could hear Joe waiting. "I fell," Miles said again. Joe sighed and grabbed the tea towel of ice out of his hands. He went to walk away, but Miles stopped him. "I know what happened to Mum," he said. "You don't think I don't. You think I don't, but I do. I know she crashed the car on purpose. I know she wanted to die." Joe grabbed hold of him and squeezed his arms hard. "Why would you say that? Why would you even think that? Jesus Christ, Miles, it's not true." He tucked the tea towel into the ground and the ice cubes threw across the boards. "She had this condition, high blood pressure. She took medication for it. That day in the car, her blood pressure got really high and she just had a heart attack. That's it. She just died. She just had a heart attack and crashed the car and bloody died." Joe pushed Miles away. He stormed into the kitchen and slammed the door. Out of the corner of his eyes, Miles knew Harry was right there, that he'd seen everything and heard everything, but Miles didn't speak. He didn't say anything. He just closed his eyes and pretended that Harry wasn't there, that he couldn't hear him or feel him, and that Harry didn't exist. He put his hand in his pocket, clutched the tooth tightly in his hand, and the sharp edges almost piercing his skin. He knew that the tooth belonged to him, and that was his, that it was his. Harry got up. The clock in the kitchen said 9:20. "God," he said, "slept 8 for ages." Hadn't even heard Miles get up and go. There was still no bread, but it was Wednesday. Milk got delivered on Monday and Wednesday and Friday, and sometimes Dad ordered bread when he remembered about it. Harry stuffed his feet into his gumboots and ran down the drive to the road. He opened the meat safe that hung on the wire fence. Just milk. He carried 2 bottles back to the kitchen and poured himself a glass. There was no one at George's by the time Harry got there. He waited for a while on the veranda and then he walked slowly to the back of the property. He passed the veggie patch and the wood pile. He passed the smokehouse, but it wasn't being used. There was no smoke, no smell coming out from it. He kept on walking and he found a shed he hadn't seen before. It was right in amongst the trees and it didn't have a door, just an opening and a wall missing. It was packed full of junk, rusted paint cans, an old lawnmower, a metal bath full of broken tiles and rubble. Harry didn't look too far inside because he knew there would be spiders around, and not just huntsmen but bad spiders. Redbacks and those shiny black ones that hid in busted tractors and rusted cars and any metal that had been eaten away. He was careful not to touch anything and he stepped away and he heard a dog bark. Jake. The sound was coming from down towards the bay. Harry followed. George was in a dark green waders down by the water's edge. The tide was way out and the place stunk of mud and slime. Jake leapt from the thin wooden jetty and ran around Harry's feet and licked his hands. George climbed down the ladder into his old wooden dinghy. He sat down and patted the seat next to him. He wanted Harry to come, and even Jake wasn't scared. He ran past Harry and jumped in the boat and perched himself right up at the tip of the bow. "I get sick," said Harry quietly. The water was still, brown and silty and full of tannin from the river, but George would be going out deep past the heads where the swell took hold of you as soon as the engine stopped. Out there the water rocked and pulled and pushed you until your stomach turned over and your eyes rolled backwards and you felt like you might be dying. "I can't go,"